Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to provide you with some information to help you read John Donne's Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, much as I did with Giovanni Boccaccio. So we'll start with some biographical information. John Donne lived from 1572 to 1631, so he would be considered an early modern or Renaissance author. He resided in Britain. He spent most of his professional life in London, and he worked as a minister. In particular, he was a vicar, which is kind of a head minister of several parishes. But in addition to that, he was also a poet and a scholar. Now, in 1623, which is about 8 years before he died, he contracted what has been called a relapsing fever, that was essentially sweeping through London. In essence, he caught a disease that was sweeping through as an epidemic. We don't really know what the fever was that he caught. We don't have a diagnostic name for it. But people have reported from that period that the fever is defined by two separate moments in time. The initial stage, when you first contract the fever, is a very dangerous point, when many people can die. If you live through that, there then was the probability of a recurrence of the fever, the relapsing portion of that fever, which could occur during the convalescence. So it was under these conditions that Donne began to write Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, really as a means to think through his experience. He did most of it as he was convalescing, that is, recovering from the fever. Now, if you read through Donne's Devotions upon Emergent Occasions and found it impenetrable, or at the very least rather confusing, basically you are not alone. Don't worry. Most people find Donne's writing extremely dense, complex, and hard to understand, but also just richly evocative and really interesting to study. John Donne is what's considered a metaphysical poet. It was part of a group of poets in the 17th century in Britain. They wrote these kinds of intellectual and rhetorically acrobatic works of literature that concern themselves with the nature of man, the nature of the world, and with the nature of spirituality. John Donne's works, including the Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, tend to be sort of scattershot in their ideas. What I mean by this, and you'll see it particularly in the various stations and devotions, is that he has one idea or metaphor, and then it begins to sort of seamlessly melt into another one. So what you end up with is a kind of tornado of developing ideas. And this Devotions is also written in a way in which it gives the reader the impression of being very kind of up close and personal with Donne as he goes through the experience of being ill, thinking that he might die, and then cogitating the nature of illness and of spirituality. And one critic has written that it's helpful almost to think of yourself, the reader, as watching a kind of performance of John Donne, where John Donne is sort of the main actor in a one-man play. Now, structurally, Devotions upon Emergent Occasions is set up as 23 stations, which represent different points in his illness. I've only given you a few of those stations to read. Each station is divided into 3 sections. Roughly, they're meditations, expostulations, and prayers. Now, on the one hand, there is a narrative arc to Devotions upon Emergent Occasions. It unfolds a bit like any story. So it's going to take us to the experience of him getting sick, of that sickness reaching a kind of crescendo point, and then of him recovering. And the narrative is part of what links together all of those different stations. In addition to that kind of narrative arc, the stations are also linked by recurring intellectual ideas and rhetorical patterns. So recurring metaphors or recurring ideas related to metaphors or to different leitmotifs. But on the other hand, while this work is one complete structure, each station, or even each individual section within the station, is its own intellectual exercise. And another thing to remember about him is that he's really using his illness. He's both thinking through his illness, but he is also utilizing his illness as a writer and as a thinker. And he's a kind of writer that revels in contradictions. So if you're looking for some kind of resolution for different ideas or metaphors that he has, you're oftentimes not going to find one. I'll point out two central contradictions that we see in our writings from today. The first one is that on the one hand, he represents his body in all its corporeality. This is a work about him getting sick and about him, feeling really horrible because he's getting sick, because he's getting a fever, eventually because he gets different spots on him. So there is this level at which his body is really a body. At the same time, he uses his body as a kind of metaphor, in particular, a metaphor to think about spirituality. So, for example, the spots that emerge on his body become for him a symbol by which he can talk about his sins. Thus, and similar, the disease itself becomes both a disease that he anticipates killing him, or that he anticipates he may die from, but also by de facto a means of preparing for his own death and for a reconciliation with God. And then similarly, at times he sees his own body as actually becoming both an altar to God and also a sacrifice to God. So that's one of the contradictions. The second contradiction that I see in this text is his belief that illness is a kind of mixed blessing for him. On the one hand, he suffers anxiety, and he suffers, obviously pain. He suffers all kinds of worry, thinking that he is going to die and just being sick. But on the other hand, this illness serves as an occasion for him to think through his relationship with God, and then to also think about kind of central questions about theology. So, for example, he asks, why does God permit illness? Why do people get ill? And then he thinks through the idea that maybe disease is, a dress rehearsal for death. And if that's the case, then how should we be imagining, or how should he be coming to terms with his disease? So some questions that I want you to think about as you read are thus. One, how does Donne use religion as a kind of lens through which to think about his illness? And then similarly, does thinking about one's illness as a religious experience change the way in which one views the illness? And by this I mean, does Donne gain a new understanding or a different understanding of his illness by imagining it as a test, as a spiritual test for him, or as a means of greater spirituality? And the second one relates to Donne versus Boccaccio, which is, do you have a different reading experience when reading Donne versus when reading Boccaccio? And why do you think that might be? Is it, the style in which they're writing? Is it the sophistication of their ideas? Is it the effect of examining an entire culture versus examining one person? These are just some different ideas to help you get started with your reading. Please let me know if you have any questions regarding the John Donne. As I said before, it's very complex. This may be, again, much like the Elaine Scarry, a work that you may have to read more than once, but it's definitely well worth your time and attention to read it. All right, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you on the discussion board.